Dan mentioned before break, we are now going to turn to party presentations. The list is up here. We have Joe with HECO going first, Steve and Michael, perhaps, with the Consumer Advocate, and then Ron with Blue Planet, Mark with the Hawaii PV Coalition, and to finish us off, Kyle with Ulupono. So, Joe, let's see, there he is. You are up first. Oh, no, that's Joe, sorry, Jim. These glasses actually work, I promise. Yeah, I think they're teed up there. Yeah, and I want to remind all of our presenters to please speak into the mic so folks who are watching this remotely can listen.
Is this on? Okay.
And you have 7 minutes.
Well, I'm off to a bad start because I was compared to Jim or mistaken for Jim, and that is can only go uphill, I guess, from here. So anyway, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Joe Viola from on behalf of the Hawaiian Electric Company. So I would like to begin by saying as well, I thought it was a brilliant idea to have analysts come in and present their perspective. That's a notion that's very important to all of us, actually, and I don't know that it's always I haven't experienced that be part of our docket, so I thought that was a great idea, and I applaud them too for coming down and great discussion. A little closer. It's probably best if you don't hear what I have to say. It'll sound smarter. Anyway, as we discussed at the last workshop, our view is that our framework works well in many respects, but it definitely needs to continue to evolve. We agree with the staff that one way to evaluate our current existing regulatory framework is to consider whether it encourages or incentivizes desired outcomes. However, I think it's probably more important, and I think our exercise this morning demonstrated that. It's very difficult to just focus on one outcome because, as the staff has recognized, as the Commission and others have recognized, there's a lot of interrelationship between outcomes. So I think it's critical as we all look at these outcomes that we want to promote and how our regulatory environment is working, that we consider the interplay between those outcomes, because ultimately we have some outcomes that may be competing with each other. So I think our task together is to design a framework that balances those outcomes. And what the right balance is, may be in the eye of the beholder, but I think that's the discussion that we have to have. I only have a few minutes, probably, I think 8 minutes left. Okay. Just a quick note first note on capital investment. We understand there's a desire to focus on what isn't working well or isn't working well enough in our existing framework, and that makes a lot of sense because that's what we got to spend our time on trying to correct. But I think it's also important to remain mindful of what aspects of the framework are effective and consider too whether those can be improved upon, or at least in considering the other modifications we're making, that we don't undermine what's working well. So the existing framework does support and encourage capital investments. This was historically important. It was significant capital investment was required in the first place to establish our grid. It was important to expand the grid and provide safe, reliable, and adequate service. I think it's been recognized today that the capital investment is still important in our environment, and it will be important going forward to achieve a number of desired and potential outcomes. As the staff and the Consumer Advocate have recognized, significant capital investment is likely required to achieve the state's clean energy goals. Likewise, capital investment will be required to modernize and harden our grid and to continue to provide safe, reliable, adequate electric service. Electrification of transportation, too, may require significant capital investment. However, like anything else, aspects of our framework can be improved upon. For example, the companies recognize that we need to address the Commission, Consumer Advocate, and others' concern with the level of certain capital expenditures. For example, baseline expenditures. We need to address that in a manner that gives the Commission, the Consumer Advocate, and our stakeholders confidence that the amount of investment is appropriate and is providing value. The indications are right now that our process is not doing that. So we need to look at ways to improve that aspect of our framework and our processes. From the company's perspective, you've heard it today a little bit, reducing investment or recovery lag or earnings lag embedded in our system or incidental to our system is important to the company. We believe that would promote the utility's financial integrity, which is an acknowledged critical theme. On the other hand, much of what is expected of us today does not involve capital investment. Rather, it involves operational expenditures to facilitate, coordinate, promote, procure, administer, and provide other types of services to advance desired outcomes. Just a few of these include resource and grid planning, acquiring renewable energy from third parties, acquiring demand response resources, enabling DER markets, facilitating and administering community-based renewable energy, promoting customer choice and engagement, and coordination and collaboration to support energy efficiency and conservation, and potentially grid and platform services. Our existing framework clearly does not provide direct positive incentives to produce outcomes that are predominantly service type in nature. With limited exceptions, the company receives no return on these expenditures, and there are no other direct positive incentives to achieve these outcomes. Indeed, it might be said that the companies have been achieving some of these outcomes despite the existing regulatory framework. The exceptions I mentioned a moment ago relate to the recent Commission orders establishing one-time specific upside financial performance incentive measures relating to DR procurement and renewable energy procurement from third parties. The companies believe the Commission has been very progressive in that regard. We applaud it, we support it. We think we need to expand the notion of that to other outcomes that are similar. We think similar positive financial metrics can and should be developed to balance and support the company's efforts to achieve desired outcomes that do not involve capital investment opportunities. And we would like to consider a sustained as opposed to one-time or programmatic incentives. Just to note a few examples, energy policy PIMs could be developed to support and encourage outcomes related to DER integration, community-based renewable energy, RPS achievement, electrification of transportation, further additions of third-party renewable energy to the system, maybe shared savings related to DR programs. Hawaii will be largely breaking new ground to do this. And we'll have to work hard together to figure out the details. The details matter. We've got hard work in front of us. But this would meaningfully continue to the evolution of our regulatory framework to better align with our dynamic energy environment. I should note also, we need to modernize or unbundle our rate structures as well. That's a discussion that has begun in the DER docket and will continue there as well, but it's an important piece. Quick word about multi-year rate plans. One intended benefit of a multi-year rate plan, as I understand it, is to free up resources which can then be applied to achieve other desired outcomes. Here, as a practical matter, because we have 3 utilities and staggered rate cases, we have at any given time 1, 2, or perhaps 3 rate cases operating at any given stage. So we think thought needs to be considered to consolidating the rate case proceedings. To reduce the overall resources consumed by rate cases, we also think the time is right to consider perhaps lengthening the period of time between rate cases. What's been acknowledged today, though, is very important. They work hand in hand with how effective the interim rate recovery mechanisms are. So if we're going to consider that, we also think we need to revisit or at least have a consideration of whether the interim rate recovery mechanisms are sufficient. Lastly, our multi-year rate plan does not always support the pursuit of new initiatives or mandates that arise in between rate cases. The quickening pace of change and the evolving priorities makes it difficult to have rate support for new initiatives. This can make it challenging to innovate and explore new opportunities while also achieving financial metrics and outcomes. Consideration should be given to address this. I think I'm about out of time, but thank you all again. I appreciate the cordial professional discussion we've had over these 2 workshops. So on behalf of the companies, thank you very much.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Joe. My mistake, folks. We have another worksheet. It is exactly the same as the worksheet that you filled out for Carl's presentation. I invite you, it's optional, if you want to record your various questions during these presentations on this, you guys all should have them on your paper. So I'll let you take a few minutes and jot down anything from that presentation that you want to record. It probably would be helpful to, of course, mark every question with the party presentation that it belongs to. And please let us know if you don't have enough or...
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mike Brosh. With me is Steve Carver. We're with Utilitech. We have served as the consumer advocates consultants in rate cases and other dockets here for about as long as I can remember, including the original cases around the development of the RBA and the RAM and the changes to those mechanisms over time. We appreciate the opportunity to discuss and help evaluate the existing regulatory framework. We bring a practitioner's perspective to the review of the existing framework since we've worked with it for many years and spent a lot of time in the trenches. Our presentation today will very briefly review the major components of the existing framework, recognizing significant overlap with materials included in the staff report and Carl's comments earlier today. The Commission's order indicated that we're desirous of PBR mechanisms that result in greater cost control and reduced rate volatility, efficient investment and allocation of resources regardless of capital versus expense, fair distribution of risks between utilities and customers, and fulfillment of the state's policy goals. We'll suggest in comments today some concerns and criteria for use in this review and touch upon some directional paths toward improvements that could be considered. More detail will be provided in the Consumer Advocates Brief after considering input from this workshop. I think it's helpful to keep in mind the big picture when evaluating the regulatory framework. Specifically, we should be aware of the relative importance of the different kinds of costs within the customer's bills and how they're treated in the existing regulatory framework. Historically, fuel and purchased energy costs comprise more than half of a HECO customer's bills. This is a bar chart from the HECO website that shows the constituent parts of customers' bills through time. With the transition to an ECRC mechanism in place of ECAC, the customer's bills will begin to reflect the entire amount of energy costs, focusing a lot more public attention in this area. We support more rigorous regulatory oversight of this largest single cost element than has occurred in the past. O&M is also an important contributor of nearly 20% of the overall customer bill. O&M is more controllable by management than fuel and energy costs, and improved incentives could be effective here when aimed at O&M. Return on investment and depreciation are relatively smaller, still at about 10% of customers' bills. Surprisingly, taxes are larger than rate of return, but are largely derivative as revenue taxes and income taxes. Surcharges make up the balance for public benefit, energy efficiency funding, RBA, RAM, and the like, other forms of piecemeal cost recoveries. The ECAC is becoming the energy cost recovery clause, with no energy costs recovered through base rates. The recovery of fuel and energy costs are of great importance to HECO and its customers. More regulatory attention should be and has been focused here, with 2% cost variance sharing now installed for the HECO company, and heat rate incentive resets and other procedural changes in mind to install the ECRC. Energy costs are large and relatively volatile, which is why they're tracked in nearly every rate jurisdiction, including Hawaii. Fuel clause is important to provide financial stability to the utilities. There is limited management control over these costs, which is also why continued tracking of cost variances is needed. The PUC provides oversight of fuel and purchase power contracts, but much more could be done here, and the Consumer Advocate continues to support periodic financial and management audits of fuel and energy costs to verify financial inputs and review the procurement and administration of fuel supplies, dispatch and operation of power plants, and operational prudence in general. The PPAC is the mechanism through which all non-energy purchase power costs are recovered. None of these purchased power demand charges are in base rates like the new ECRC, zero-based. 100% tracking and recovery of PPA expense variances was determined to be needed to encourage utilities to contract for renewable energy to create essentially no regulatory lag in the recovery of these costs. With PUC oversight of resource procurement and PPAs, this mechanism supports the timely recovery of PUC-approved purchase power costs.
Triennial rate cases are used to reset base rates relying upon forecasted test year expense, updated rate base, and an updated cost of capital determination by the Commission. The target revenues from rate cases are then tracked through the decoupling RBA process and escalated between test years. Rate case regulation in Hawaii involves minimal regulatory lag relative to other states because of the use of forecasted rather than historical data and the granting of interim rate increases. Base rate cases are tedious, time-consuming, and require the production and review of substantial volumes of detailed forecast documentation. Notably, the forecasting process can be fraught with misestimates and errors that are only revealed via a detailed documentation review, typically spearheaded by the consumer advocate. Any revision to the regulatory framework that relies substantially on comparable utility-prepared forecasts should not be expected to be any different because of the inherently pessimistic bias in utility forecasts prepared for regulatory purposes. The coupling of the triennial rate case cycle with RBA RAM levelized administrative workload by requiring one rate case to be processed each year rather than 2 or 3 rate cases in any particular year, and provided a price path between rate cases that moderated the potential for near annual base rate cases filed by each of the HECO rate case companies. Of these exceptional cost recovery mechanisms that exist in Hawaii, the staff report discusses MPIR, which provides an opportunity for the recovery between rate cases of PUC-approved major project costs in excess of the RAM cap. The other listed items in the table provide a mechanism for piecemeal recovery of other exceptional costs that are deemed to be in the public interest, including renewable, supportive infrastructure costs, funding for energy efficiency programs, and tracking of other changes in pension and OPEB costs that are driven by changing actuarial assumptions. It is difficult to accurately quantify and provide cost recovery for these costs within triennial rate cases. The Commission has established reporting metrics and performance incentive mechanisms to address reliability metrics that include SAFE and SAIDI, with a third PIM for responses to customer calls within call centers. PIMs focus management and regulatory attention upon performance against specified metrics and targets, with financial rewards and penalties intended to compensate for desired levels of performance.
All right, and if you can just wrap it up real quick, that'd be fantastic. Thank you.
Go ahead.
This phase of the PBR docket is to evaluate the current regulatory framework. The diversity of interest among participants will challenge us to agree on the goals and priorities to be pursued and the criteria to apply. The alignment of many elements of the existing framework is a result of the cumulative work of the PUC, the CA, and other parties with PUC decisions across many prior dockets. The CA will continue to prioritize affordability, core customer needs, equitable customer empowerment, and resource planning goals. These are not new priorities, but have been advanced consistently by the consumer advocate in the past. The existing framework, it might be considered as leaning more towards the traditional. This slide is intended to kind of characterize and position the various elements of the framework. Traditional cost recovery is the focus of the capped RAM and triennial rate cases and the extraordinary cost recovery mechanisms. Other elements of the framework tend to be more aligned and gradually moving toward performance goal satisfaction. So much of what we're talking about here is shifting some of these elements toward the right. Here are the negative and affirmative arguments around whether the traditional mechanism is working as intended. So this is the big question, where do we find the right balance given these attributes of the traditional model? The Commission has outlined goals and outcomes that are useful lens to review these. In our view, we should attempt to simplify regulation by granting extraordinary cost recovery only in extraordinary cases. So here are some suggested directional changes for better outcomes, focusing on cost reduction and efficiency encouragement within the regulatory rate-making regime, and focusing more on performance with targeted and carefully calculated PIMs. Here are some suggested post-assessment tools that might be considered as we look at the options, perhaps with more focused on these tools in phase 2 of this docket. We believe there are considerable risks arising from changes to the regulatory framework, poorly specifying performance goals and targets, potential gaming of multi-year rate plans and PIMs, the utility's asymmetric access to information, and the forecasting bias that Steve spoke of. So the goal here is, in spite of these challenges, to find a way to overcome that list and create improved performance at lower cost for consumers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Great. It's a lot of good information in there.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for this opportunity. I want to start by saying that however this process comes out, I think the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission is going to become famous for the process it's using to investigate this issue. This is really a remarkable gathering and proceeding, and I congratulate all who are responsible for this. Toby's introduction today was a pleasant surprise to me. I've worked with Moody's people, and you are the most creative Moody's person I've run into, Toby. Your first slide said cost of service regulation takes the utility. I know, I won't let anybody hear that back home. Oh, it's being broadcast. Oh. All right. I was talking about Toby Smith. Is he still here? Okay. You said that cost of service regulation puts utility on the wrong path, and I agree completely. It was the right path for many years in this country, but it is no longer serving its purpose. Blue Planet agrees with that. In a case 3 years ago at this commission, we first introduced what I called an American Rio approach. I think Rio has many positive attributes, but it is got some problems as well, including the huge administrative overhead of actually using it. So my presentation today is going to kind of jump to the end. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on process. What I will present today is what I hope is a coherent summary of Blue Planet's position on these high-level regulatory issues. The ideas we put out today are in addition to substantial, robust PIMs that we have been talking about in previous presentations. And the organizing principles for the proposal we're going to lay out today is that we want to build on the Hawaii Commission's progress to date. We think that many of the regulatory mechanisms that are used here are very important, very progressive, but they can be pushed a little farther to pick up more of the goals that we wish to achieve. I think firm efficiency is a very big deal for any utility, and I happen to believe that a lot can be achieved by the right regulatory approach that moves away from cost of service regulation. We've talked about the CapEx bias. That's another thing that our proposal hopes to address, to put CapEx and OpEx on a more nearly equal footing. And finally, HECO and every other American utility needs some space for transforming themselves the way everybody thinks they need to be transformed. We don't necessarily know what the end product is going to be, but if they're shackled with the traditional regulatory methods, there's really not going to be a lot of opportunity for that. So what I did was I took the 3 columns in the staff's report of all of the existing mechanisms, and I'd like to suggest what kind of transition from those to a new place that might be possible. The 3-year rate case cycle will turn into a 5-year or hopefully 8-year rate control period. The revenue decoupling mechanism would be maintained in principle. There might be tweaks and adjustments. I'm not endorsing it per se as it is. The RAM attrition mechanism, now I just want to say one word first about that. Right, the structure in this state is a rate case every 3 years and then something to get you from one place to the other. That's what it is. So it's anchored to cost of service. We might talk about how incentivizing the RAM adjustment is, but it's always ending up at the next rate case 3 years later. So you are anchored to cost of service. Our proposal will be to replace that RAM mechanism with a mechanism which would run for the 5 years, 8 years, which is essentially RPI minus X, some sort of inflation measure minus a productivity offset, possibly plus a Z factor, which is the consumer dividend, or it depends on your jurisdiction what it is, but that's the notion. It's a revenue cap. When you marry the RAM attrition, when you marry GPI PI minus X to the revenue decoupling, you get what's known as revenue cap regulation. The major projects in the MPIR needs to be maintained in some way. Investment's too lumpy to simply assume that RPI minus X will cover every instance. And so there would be a parallel track for interim recovery of approved large capital expenses. But the baseline of expenses would go through this RPI or GPI minus X. The major projects in baseline projects credit, which as I understand it is something which should be maintained. The earnings sharing mechanism, in my view, could be eliminated to sharpen the point, as Carl was talking about this morning, or shrunk somewhat to a 25% sharing mechanism. And the ECRC has been modified. I would propose that we maintain that with possibly an increased sharing ratio from 2% to a higher number than that. The left-hand column on each of these slides comes from the staff's report for this workshop. Metric reporting requirements would be unchanged except possibly streamlined. The set of PIMs, which today are these compliance PIMs and backstop PIMs, should be folded into a broader set of policy PIMs, something we discussed significantly last time. And Blue Planet thinks there should be a lot of money attached to these. We don't, as somebody pointed out, put a couple $1 million in the pot, and it's probably not worth going through all the pain to develop them. So we would propose that there be significant upside and downside for non-performance. The ECRC, I've already said, and the ECAC generating efficiency, that's the heat rate adjustment, we have been on record as advocating its elimination. We don't think it actually serves the purpose, and the wider deadband that's just been adopted will make it the case that it will not function very often anyway. The last set of non-revenue regulatory provisions, the RPS, system planning requirements, competitive bidding, approval of major capital projects, all of that we would suggest could be maintained or modified slightly, but in principle maintained. So in summary, what you're seeing proposed by Blue Planet, or will be proposed by Blue Planet at the appropriate time, is an extension of where we are today, tweaking in some ways, but in important ways, how rates are set, not just in order to get from one rate case to the next rate case, but for the longer period of time. This last will be controversial. The question always happens, what do you do at the end of the 8-year period? Well, there's lots of things you should say about that. First, 8 years is a very long time in this world, so I don't think we even have to have an answer, but the possibilities are you keep going, that's obvious. You could reset base rates and keep going, and how you reset base rates could be through cost of service or negotiate or index rates. I tend not to like using cost of service 8 years from now, because that sort of tells you that in the interim adding to rate base is going to help your revenue requirement even if it's 8 years out. You could also allow carryover of gained efficiencies. That's sort of you don't take it all away in the rate case, or whatever the rate setting is. You can modify the parameters of the PBR regime, the X factors, the Z factors. You can evolve the regulatory structure to something allied but different. You could go from the RPI minus X model to a Rio model or something else. Or you could return to cost of service regulation. You may find, I don't think you will, but you may find that that's more appropriate. Thank you. I'm sorry I've run over a little bit. Appreciate the opportunity to make this presentation. Happy to chat with anybody about this.
Great. Thanks so much, Ron. Mark with Hawaii PV Coalition.
Hi, it's Mark Duda from the Hawaii PV Coalition. My comments here are specifically to address the Commission's directive to illuminate regulatory outcomes or specific areas of utility performance that are currently well served by existing framework, as well as which specific areas of utility performance are not well served. So I'll start with my conclusion and then back up to provide some evidence and support. And the conclusion is customer choice and DERS integration are poorly served by the existing framework. From a theoretical perspective, this shouldn't really be surprising. The existing framework doesn't provide any inherent motivation or direct incentive for the utility to excel at DERS integration, irrespective of how much utility customers may want it and would like to install DERS. And further, at the margin, customer-cited DERS threaten utility revenues by eroding grid-served load and increasingly offering the promise of providing other services that have historically been the province of the utility. So it's sort of naive and unreasonable to expect a utility facing this kind of regulation, even one whose revenues are decoupled from one rate case to the next, to embrace a product that causes the erosion of generation opportunities and further leads to creeping opportunities for third-party provision of grid services, such as DERS does. So, as I said, that's from a theoretical perspective, but this has really always been the case. It's not actually anything new, and these theoretical concerns don't really matter much in practice if DERS aren't cheaper or otherwise preferred by utility customers to utility-provided power. And so this is why the tension between the goals of utility customers and the goals of the utility didn't really exist until about a decade ago when rooftop PV first emerged as a cost-effective alternative. If we count this year, that's actually about 11 years since PV began to capture the attention of utility customers. And in my mind, you can divide this era into three sort of sub-periods. So phase one, which is roughly 2008 to 2012, I would say that this sort of incentive problem resulted in underinvestment by the utilities in just understanding DERS and the impact of DERS, which we called DG at that time, on the utility grid. And you could see this over the sort of extended discussions that we had to go through to get the access for net metering, which again was effectively what DERS was at that time. It expanded from 0.5% to 1% of peak load. That took a couple of years. Extended negotiations to go from there to up to 3%, and then of course this morphed into the circuit level 15% rule, which was also just something that happened to exist from a world in which nobody thought that there were going to be really any DG to be integrated, certainly not at that level either. And so very rationally, I don't think that anybody could have expected the utility to be an expert on the integration of intermittent renewable resources onto distribution feeders, especially on the neighbor islands where they kind of hit first, where power was most expensive. And so in summary, I don't think that the utility was particularly adept at the engineering or science behind DG integration in this first period because there was no reason for them to be up to that point. And they didn't really face any incentive in sort of getting ahead of the curve. So the second phase, which is maybe 2013 to 2015 or into 16, I would call active opposition. And so in this period, we could also call the transient overvoltage era, in which it seemed like the utility was looking for ways to argue that no more PV could be safely added to the grid. The theoretical underpinnings of this were kind of removed by the NREL study that Solar City and HECO did together, And even after that, it was sort of months before the results had been internally reviewed and were able to be released and could be sort of integrated into the review of the sort of backlog of interconnections that had been held up at the 100% of peak load stage, I think it was at that point. So following this, what you also saw was a rhetorical pivot from these engineering concerns to the unfairness of net metering, which had always kind of been there but ramped up after the engineering issue kind of went out of the way. And so, in summary, for this period, I think this was the utility waking up to the threat of DG and began working in various ways to thwart it, which caused a lot of delay, chaos, and churning, but ultimately didn't really reduce customers' appetite for DERs at the end of the day. So finally, we're into this third period, which I think dates from the end of NEM, or maybe not too long after the end of NEM. And I don't actually know what this period ought to be called or is going to end up being revealed to have been mostly about. The two sort of candidates I have are death by 1,000 cuts or grudging acquiescence to the Commission's directive. And this is not anti-anybody. This is like, we have bad rules, okay? So that said, this was a major change, but it still didn't change the incentives that DERs posed to the under the current regulatory regime. So as a result, unsurprisingly, we didn't get a super expeditious implementation of the Commission's new master stroke of customer self-supply and customer grid supply, as the customers and presumably the Commission itself would have liked, but rather many months to come up with an application, and once it arrived, it was kind of long and cryptic and subject to denial for a lot of reasons, which weren't clear to the solar industry or the customers. Even getting documents released and issues associated with it resolved often involved going to the Commission just to get them to come sort of babysit us as we tried to work it out together, which again is just a frustrating way to work, and things didn't happen very quickly. So in summary, even in this post-net metering world, the utility is not regulated in such a way that it has any kind of incentive to address customers' demand for a functioning successor to NEM, or to integrate storage for that matter, either with existing systems or new systems. So to sum up, as I said at the beginning, customer choice and DERS integration are poorly served by the current framework. This has been a consistent theme throughout the DERS era, even as customer demand, penetration levels, utility knowledge of, and understanding of the capability of DERS has evolved and increased substantially. So I said earlier, this is just the intersection of two facts. Customers today have access to a source of kilowatt hours that they prefer to utility kilowatt hours, and the utility is regulated in a way that this situation is bad for them. So as a result, if we do nothing in this proceeding, we should explicitly seek to make the integration of resources that customers want something that the utility also wants, which is presently not the case, and we can't assume that this thing is going to work itself out along the way, as I think effectively we have been up to this point. Thank you.
Perfectly timed. Thank you. All right, Kyle, for our last party presentation.
First of all, we want to thank the Commission and everyone here and their consultants for this process. We think the process is actually helpful because it's taking us on a journey of shared discovery. So we're going to use our 10 minutes to comment on this stage of the process, and we recognize that staff is trying
Technically
to
7, but okay.
staff is trying to achieve an outcome in terms of asking us to fill out these matrices and whatnot. But we think there's a challenge to the way they're doing it, and also in terms of limiting the number of outcomes that we can discuss. So on your table and with the Commission, we have a little document, which is not part of the slideshow, and we just want to talk to you about this for a moment, which is, we don't think you can pick apart the regulatory framework piece by piece. It was actually designed to function in clusters. And we also believe a number of the outcomes laid out in the most current staff report are in fact outcomes we have today that are essentially traditional. And the challenge we're being asked to do is how do we assess the regulations? And so really there's two questions. First, how is the current regulatory framework doing against the outcomes traditionally that we think it's supposed to be doing now. We have a bunch of outcomes now. Then, to Mark's point and Ron's point and many other points, how would that same set of regulations do against a lot of new outcomes we think will be important in the very near future? They're actually two different questions. So, our suggestion for folks' considerations is as follows. The current regulatory framework actually clusters into some logical groupings, which was how it was designed in the first place. There's a lot of things around cost of service and multi-year rate cases and all the things you got to do in the interim. They come as a bundle. There was revenue decoupling. There's a set of pass-through mechanisms. There were PIMs targeted at specific management focus around specific things. And then there was things that we worried about in terms of competition, which of course is important if we're going to buy lots of stuff. And then lastly, legal mandates. There were outcomes associated with all of these things that exist today that are on the staff table. So we just took the staff work and recategorized it into essentially logical bundles. So one way to pick it up is to say, in total, you should look at the whole thing. How are we doing? Is this working at all? Where's the areas where it might be gamed, etc. Then, if we apply those same clusters to something new, DER, or resilience, or EOT, other outcomes, how do these clusters do against that? We think that's going to give staff the consistency in reporting they need, but also be more valid in terms of what we're doing. The other thing, which I think the CA's consultants were trying to bring up, and we totally concur, is what criteria do we use to say good or bad? And we're not suggesting that everyone has to have the same criteria. We're suggesting that making your criteria transparent will help us understand why you came to that judgment. We're just going to offer you some. They're very actually similar to the CA's. We felt, like the staff said, there were three major outcomes. One of the criteria foundationally that you ask is, will the framework in fact create some, is there gaming opportunities in the current framework? Are the elements at cross purposes? Is the framework flexible to adjust for technological shift or changing policies? Would it enable customer choice if that was a new major outcome? So those are questions and criteria to ask. That's foundational. Then there's a set of criteria which I think the CA picked up on because frankly they have to do it, which is execution. You know, do the regulators have the institutional capacity and capabilities to actually administer the framework? Is the framework clarity reasonably objective or the goals subjective? Is there significant information asymmetry or high cost to get information to actually do an element of this framework? Or is it overly complex in a way that renders it infeasible? And by the way, these criteria can apply to both what we're doing now and any future frameworks, like Ron proposed a whole future framework that we may postulate in the future. The last set of criteria is management, which is, again, from your redo frameworks and incentives, you're trying to get an organization which is run by management to do something. So it has to have some adherence to management control principles. It has to be in their control. We have to make sure there's not free rider effects. It has to be significant enough to make it worth the transactional cost. If you're going to do an operational PIM, it's a reality test to say, could you actually translate that down to someone in the line in a meaningful way, or is it too abstract? If it's too abstract, it won't actually affect anyone at the coalface. And then if we're doing an assessment, really, we have to ask another question, which is actually internal, which is, hey, should the PUC be the organizational entity to regulate every one of these elements? Or as we add other elements, can we actually offload some to someone else and have the PUC focus here? Because that's a better place for the work to be. We went off the criteria in both foundational, executional, and management terms. And then lastly, on outcomes. So again, I think the purpose of this entire proceeding was actually not to focus on what are we doing today traditionally and how are we doing. I think that's a question, that's fair, but that wasn't really why we're all here and so excited. The question was, what should we read, what new outcomes are important tomorrow and what frameworks make sense? That's the part that we're trying to get to. I understand the Commission's desire to understand, hey, given what we're doing today, how's it working? So we think that, again, that's one question. We believe it's helpful to say, all of those outcomes don't count. That's what we have today. If you want to tell us what your 5 top priorities are, tell us your 5 top priorities on what are the new outcomes that we're not doing today and how would the framework apply? Because that will start to get a sense from the group about, do we have a shared set of important outcomes we all think are relevant, and how do we feel about how the framework's working against those? Because I think part of this process is designed for us to learn from each other, and we respect that part of the process, and we actually are glad to be in the journey with you. So we want to offer an approach which builds on the staff's approach, tries to meet their outcomes. We welcome comment, we're not attached to it, but we did feel that we need to find a way to report back in a systematic way that aligned with how the regulations really work today, and then report back in a way that separates clearly what are we doing now versus what do we hope we can do, so that we can see clearly the difference between the two. And this is not to necessarily recap all the different commentary in the many cases about the concerns with some of the things that are here. So thanks for your time. We hope this process approach is helpful. We would be delighted to talk to any of the stakeholders about aligning with you guys on sharing sort of the same process of reporting back or something similar. Again, just to streamline, not the answer, but the way that we describe how we're looking at the problem. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Before we transition into our next activity, I invite you to turn to your partner and share either a question you jotted down or an insight or takeaway that you are going to be taking with you away after hearing those presentations, and perhaps integrating into your party comments or just discussions going forward.
All right, so we have one more group activity, and in your table groups, which are about between 6 and 8, take about 20 minutes. I don't know if you can see this, but I'll make another flip chart if we need be, but answering the question, which outcomes are most appropriate to target for further improvement and not sufficiently supported by the current framework. So given all that we've heard today from the party presentations and your work earlier with the assessment template, which outcomes are most appropriate to target for further improvement and not sufficiently supported by the current framework? All right, and then the second question is, what can be done to improve achievement of this outcome? So Kara's coming around, but of course there's a flip chart template that you can use. So choosing 3 outcomes that are most appropriate to target for attention, that is the column on the left. And then some ideas around what can be done to improve achievement of this outcome on the right-hand side. There should be Post-its and Sharpies at your table, and if you need more supplies, let us know. So you have 20 minutes as a group to talk around these questions and put your thoughts on the flip charts. Thanks. All right, thank you very much. We'll now have a chance to hear just what the 3 outcomes your table chose. So if I can ask either Kara or Dan to help with the mic, to just share which 3 outcomes you chose, and then we'll have one final activity. Which table would, all right. Ron would like to go first.
We have 3. The first one is a mashup of...
You want to use...
We have 3. The first one is a mashup of interconnection experience and DER asset effectiveness. The second one is cost control, and the third one is carbon intensity.
Thank you very much.
All right.
All right.
Well, following Ron's lead, we have 3, and we also did a mashup because we really do believe they're linked. So we absolutely agree that interconnection experience, DER asset effectiveness, customer engagement, and grid investment efficiency, all those outcomes ride together. Because you can't have one without the other.
Bold interpretation of 3.
Yeah, they all actually cluster. It's just the way it works. We separated we separated capital formation, broadly speaking, all three levels, as actually a very different outcome. And we wanted to pick up in terms of new outcomes, resilience, because we think it's important.
Thank you. All right, if we can come along to this table.
Our three outcomes are affordability and cost control, interconnection, and incenting renewable PPAs.
Thank you.
Ours were kind of back to the basics. So number 1, affordability, 2, power quality, and 3, RPS. And most of these are on the table because we tend to just assume those things are naturally going to happen, but they need continued focus over time. So we just can't forget them.
Affordable, 100% renewable for all. Affordable resiliency, smart electrification, and carbon intensity reduction, I guess.
Okay.
Our table, the three outcomes we decided upon were carbon intensity, transportation electrification, also known as EOT in our jurisdiction, and interconnection experience as well.
Thanks very much. So now you'll have a chance to do a final individual activity. You've had a chance in groups to have to try and move towards consensus and see what happens in a collaborative context. And now you have a chance individually to essentially fill in the blanks of this Mad Libs. To achieve outcome fill in the blank mechanism needs to be revised to, or to achieve outcome blank, we need to develop a mechanism that. On your tables, you'll find index cards. The request here is very specific. With a ballpoint pen, I would like you to write one sentence that is succinct, clear, and most of all, legible. I have looked at the worksheets from this morning. I'm going to emphasize the legible part. If you are not sure if your handwriting is legible, ask your neighbor. Will they be able to read it? The reason that I'm emphasizing this is because we will be having these read by someone else, and so they need to be able to be read quickly without need for translation. Are there questions here? The intent here is that this is going to give something. This is a piece of information that staff will be taking back and will be able to read. So think about what is most useful in the context of this proceeding. The question, can everyone see this flip chart? Okay. I will write it on a sticky and bring it over to your table. You have a few minutes now to write down that one sentence with a ballpoint pen on an index card. No, you aren't constrained to the outcomes that the three that you just talked about or any others that have been named today. This is, from your perspective, just one outcome that is important to you in this moment. Okay, so now if everyone can stand up and join me in this area with your index card. I'm gonna pass it. It's not quite the same as last time though, but you will pass it. Okay, so now we have a chance to just mill around and exchange your index card with someone else. No need to read it, and you'll walk around and pass it to one person and then pass it to another. I promise this is not the same activity as last time. You're just exchanging your index card with someone else and then passing it along again. All right. When you feel sufficiently confident that you do not have your own index card, if we can circle up. So if we can make as close to a circle as possible in this space. I promised it was different. please don't. Okay, great. So this is the part where the legibility becomes important. We're going to just hear from each person, go around in a circle and hear exactly what is written on the index card. So maybe take a second now to look at it. So the first time you're understanding the words is not as you're saying them out loud. Okay, can I have a volunteer to go first? To just read out loud, good question, to just read out loud what is on the index card.
Oh boy. To achieve the carbon intensity outcome, we need to develop a mechanism, and then in quotation, or in parentheses, a PIM, and then in parentheses again, expand to benchmark that rewards reductions in carbon emissions.
Left or right?
Left.
All right. To improve the DER experience, we need to develop a mechanism that allows / timely compensates utility for R&D expenses in developing innovative solutions.
To achieve outcome cost control, DER effectiveness, the cost of service mechanism needs to be revisited to revenue-based control, including toll tax basis of costs.
Okay, we need to develop a mechanism that addresses utility financial preference for utility-owned CapEx versus third-party service solutions.
To achieve affordability, we need to develop a mechanism that replaces COSR in compliance with Act 5.
To achieve reduced carbon intensity, we need a performance incentive mechanism that rewards GHG reductions in a manner that meets or exceeds Act 234 with a goal of carbon neutrality.
To achieve cost control outcome, multi-year rate mechanism needs to be revised to motivate sustainable efficiency initiatives.
To achieve an outcome of having the electric utility become a platform, we need a mechanism that is able to benchmark and measure what a good platform does and what are reasonable accomplishments within a specified period of time.
To achieve customer equity, we need to develop a mechanism that facilitates timely and periodic rate unbundling and rate redesign.
To achieve outcome of carbon intensity reduction, we must both revise existing mechanisms, for example, ECAC risk sharing, and develop new mechanisms such as PIMs, encompassing a system-wide approach, including, for example, transportation and other beneficial electrification that encourage carbon reduction from a holistic perspective.
To achieve greater DER asset effectiveness, PIMs need to be developed to incentivize that effectiveness.
I got a double one here. Yeah. To achieve capital formation, the RBA mechanism needs to be revised to allow some sharing of savings between investors and customers. To achieve capital formation for third parties, a new mechanism to formalize imputation of debt needs to be developed.
Okay, this is a little hard to read. To achieve resilience, a mechanism for person days without power plus co-optimization of planning process and include resilience.
To achieve carbon intensity reduction, we need to develop a mechanism that rewards the utility for accelerating these reductions. It could also be achieved through ECRC modifications, but probably easier to do that directly.
Can I do this as Stephen Colbert doing Donald Trump? To encourage new technologies, we need an opportunity for utility to request ex ante approval and a special cost tracker, e.g. pilot utility storage program. Sad, fake news.
To achieve the outcome of electrification of transportation, we need to develop a mechanism that incentivizes EV adoption and encourages smart load building.
To lose weight, we must eat fewer calories.
Take two.
All right, take two. We need to develop a limited number of new reward-only energy policy PIMs to achieve clean energy outcomes.
To achieve DER utilization effectiveness outcomes, we need a mechanism that rewards or incentivizes the utility to facilitate this rather than reverting to traditional, rather than investing in traditional utility assets.
To reduce carbon intensity, we need a PIM that positively incentivizes the utility to reduce fossil fuel usage, add more renewables, and increase distributed generation.
To achieve cost control, ECAC needs to be revised to have more utility skin in the game.
To achieve interconnection experience, we need to develop a PIM or PIMs that directly addresses streamlining the interconnection process, e.g. application complexity and costs.
To achieve affordable 100% renewables for the state, we need to develop a mechanism that rewards low-cost service that benefits all customers, like RFP PIM, but applied to DER as well.
To achieve DER adoption energy markets, we need to adopt an incentive that rewards HECO for DERs at the same rate level as CapEx or rate base.
To achieve outcome improved resilience, we need a mechanism that improves utility financial integrity.
To improve resiliency, we need a mechanism that values localized storage better. Yeah, we're sort of
To achieve affordability, we need to develop a mechanism that keeps electricity loads and sources voluntarily connected to a common system to reduce overall cost and strengthen the economy.
To achieve outcome of carbon intensity, we need a mechanism create system-wide carbon accounting, including transportation.
To achieve more affordable power, we need to develop a mechanism that breaks the relationship between CapEx and OpEx.
To achieve a better interconnection experience, the PIMS mechanism needs to be revised to add incentives for timeliness of application processing, expediting benign system approval, and increased hosting capacity initiative in the front of the meter, aka improved voltage.
To achieve the outcome of DER asset utilization, we need to develop a mechanism that properly values and stimulates a market of rapid adoption and interconnection at all rate classes. Steve.
To achieve affordability and cost control, rate cases and RAM need to be revised with longer MYRP intervals, index costs less productivity offsets, and reduce use of piecemeal cost recovery trackers and expense deferrals, and, like the ands here, a new mechanism to conduct ECRM financial and management audits as condition of tracking.
To achieve capital formation, we need to develop a mechanism that provides the opportunity to have a financially healthy utility while still having affordable rates for customers.
All right. To achieve affordability, we need to develop a mechanism that ensures fair pricing of bills for each class of customers based on income.
To achieve expedient procurement of low-cost, independently produced renewable energy, the utility must be motivated for the initial procurement process and be able to earn a fair return for the ongoing management of IPP contract and performance.
This is to achieve an outcome of interconnection experience. A PIM mechanism should be developed to incentivize timely interconnection and encourage broad opportunity for ratepayers to own and site DER.
We need to develop a mechanism that focuses on electrification with appropriate incentives so that all customers benefit. This has the added benefit of cleaning the environment.
All right. Thank you very much. I don't know what the current plan is, but we will make one, is my answer to that. I'm going to pass it.
She looks at me like I have the answer. For the microphone, we have the record on index cards. I can assure you staff will be reviewing these. I don't want to speak on behalf of staff for what will be the next step with those. But lastly, before we hear from Commissioner Griffin to close us out, one question, what we call a checkout question to complete our work together today. I'll first ask the question, and then I'm going to ask you to find someone who you have not talked to today and share your reflections with that person. So, simple enough. The question is, what is one thing that surprised you from our work together today? There it is. What is one thing that surprised you from today's workshop? Find someone who you have not spoken to today and share your answer to that question. All right, thank you. Hopefully some further insights and perhaps some surprises have surfaced in those conversations. I'm now going to invite Commissioner Griffin to make closing remarks. Perhaps we'll hear what surprised you today.
Oh,
I didn't set you up for that.
I was sitting back waiting. Okay, so first off, you're all standing, so this will be easy. So please join me in applauding our staff and consultants for all the work that's gone into it. They continue to raise the bar every workshop, so just wait for the next one. I also want to extend that to the parties, particularly, again, our folks who came here from the mainland to speak to us today. So please give them a round and yourselves. So just a few quick thoughts. First, I sat around and watched our group evolve in our discussion today. And starting with the rubric that the RMI folks laid out. We started with Dave downloading instructions on where the emergency exits were. And as I sat around and watched all of our final dialogues here, we evolved to the generative dialogue that really is kind of the elevated type of discussion, dialogue, and decision-making we get to. So I would say that's truly remarkable progress for a group as diverse as this, and extrapolating what we have been able to achieve in one day, looking forward to the next several months. I'm really excited about the progress that we're going to see in phase one here. And so speaking to that as we go forward from here, I want to reiterate what Chair Wase talked about this morning. Let's keep, again, as you go off from here, work on your briefs. Can you continue to dialogue between the parties? Always keep coming back to our focus here is about what we're doing, the best that we can do for the people of Hawaii. So as we focus on, what are our core values here, it's always got to come back to that. And so with that, thank you again for your time and efforts here. Look forward to it. Thank you for all the work that's gone in so far. Recognize that on all of your parties, reading the work. It's incredible quality things that have happened so far. We look forward to reading your briefs. And again, we'll see you at the next workshop. So, thank you.